First up, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people whose land we're meeting on today. And second, I'd like to acknowledge the AIC and the Safer Communities for inviting me to speak today. You've had a government minister, a police commissioner, one of the most eminent researchers in Australia, and now you get a PhD student. So fingers crossed. A brief outline. I'm going to try and, first of all, just make a few slides of why I'm talking here. Most of my work's not specifically about young people, but I'm just going to frame the rest of the work in terms of young people. A little bit of history of Victorian liquor licensing, a review of the literature in this area, and then basically broad trends for Victoria and a series of studies that we've undertaken at Turning Point and what it means for alcohol policy. We've heard a lot of this already these last 2 days. Alcohol's got huge impacts on health globally. In Australia, it's responsible for about 3.5% of all disease and injury. And this is much higher amongst young people. They have less disease and injury on the whole, but alcohol contributes a much larger proportion. It's almost half for young males. And we look at the leading causes of death for young people, things like road traffic accidents, suicide, other accidents, homicides. They're all highly linked to alcohol consumption. What the studies I'm going to talk about today from Victorian data focus, only the very heavy drinking study focuses specifically on young people. The other three are on assaults, domestic violence, and then chronic disease. All the harms I'm talking about here, except probably chronic disease, have a substantial component of youth involved in them. For example, this is just some data from the Victorian Police. This is drinking, showing that heavy drinking is most common amongst young adults. So 18 to 24-year-olds are regularly drinking at risky levels, as defined by the NHMRC, and around a quarter of 18 to 24-year-olds are drinking 20 or more drinks in a session at least once a year. In terms of assault victimisation, around half of all assault victims are younger than 24. Again, much higher rates for males than females. Domestic violence, fully 20% of domestic violence victims are younger than 24, and that's excluding things like the many child witnesses. We heard Adam this morning talking about the kinds of impacts that domestic violence has on young people. So there's quite a substantial relationship here between domestic violence and youth. So that's just me justifying why I'm telling you the rest of the stuff I'm telling you, which isn't so youth-focused. The key question for this presentation, and indeed for my PhD, is how are harms from alcohol linked to changes in alcohol availability, particularly in Victoria, is what I'm working on. To give some context, I'm just learning the history of liquor licensing in Victoria in the last 6 months or so. And really Victoria has a history of being quite conservative, quite a slow-moving state as far as liquor licensing goes. We were one of the first to bring in 6 o'clock closing during World War I, and we were the last to remove 6 o'clock closing. Prohibition came to 2 referendums in Victoria and came quite close, 40-odd% of the vote in one of them. So we're traditionally quite conservative. This started to shift in the late 60s, the early 60s. The first restaurant licences were brought into the system in 1960, and then a Royal Commission was held in 1963 looking at the whole liquor licensing regime. And this is what led to the pubs' closing hours moving from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. There are a series of inquiries beyond that, the major ones being a Davies inquiry in 1976, which again gradually pulled away some of the restrictions, made trading hours a bit more flexible. Some of the things that hotels had previously had to provide were stripped away. They didn't have to have quite so many rooms. But the big one, which many of you will have heard of, is the Nieuwenhuizen review in the mid-80s, which was commissioned by the Kane government. And rather than sort of the making small changes to the Act, which the previous ones had done, this ripped away the entire Act and there was a new Liquor Act implemented. And the new Act, which the government eventually, after a number of years of sort of consultation, put in place, implemented most of the recommendations of the review. And the review really was run by an economist and was focused on making the system more efficient and opening up the market. So the changes made getting a liquor licence much easier than it had been. Basically, the government talked at the time about trying to break the stranglehold of the pubs, allow new players into the market, make a more vibrant sector. So the idea that Nieuwenhuizen proposed and the government sort of went along with was that relaxing trading hours, changing some of the restrictions around food service, trying to remove ownership limits would bring a kind of European drinking culture to Victoria. You read the review and there's a section where they travelled internationally and looked at other countries and said Australia compares very badly to Italy and France and Spain, and maybe if we start shifting our regulations to match theirs, we might shift our culture along with it. We'll see how that goes as I go through the rest of the talk. The effects of the changes in terms of the Act on the market were even greater than what Nieuwenhuizen expected would happen. He expected it would sort of gradually shift things, but you'll see in a few slides that the new Act really opened the market up quite quickly. And the process of liberalising kind of carried on through the 90s, where deregulation was kind of a government project across a number of areas, not just alcohol regulation, particularly in Victoria. And the opening of Crown Casino drove some of the changes. There were some changes to the Act to allow Crown to run the way it runs. That meant other venues could also, become more bar-focused and less food-focused and trade for longer and so forth. And there was a start at trying to increase some sanctions, trying to push back a little bit, but these were mostly about underage drinking and sort of introducing on-the-spot fines, making it easier for police to fine individuals and premises for breaching licensing conditions. In general, this was largely resulted in individuals being fined. There wasn't a lot of focus on how premises were run at this point. Finally, the most recent Liquor Act came in the late 90s and was all about the state responding to pressure from the National Competition Commission, which was operating across a range of domains, but alcohol was a key one. And the Competition Commission's goal was basically to make markets freer, to make competition more prevalent so that the consumer can benefit. Not a lot of focus on public health in the kind of terms of reference that the Competition Commission focuses on. So again, we saw more relaxation of regulation. We saw the idea of a community objecting to a new licensed premise because they didn't need one was stripped away. Need didn't matter anymore. The market would determine need. If there was no need for it, it would go out of business. It could manufacture its own need if it had to. And again, these restrictions on ownership were pulled away even further. So pubs and packaged liquor outlets were at that point only one player could only own up to 8% of the market. That was taken out in this new Act, with the packaged liquor restriction being phased out over time. And what you see now, particularly with packaged liquor, is that restriction being removed has allowed the big players, the Woolworths and the Coles, to get right into the market and really open up more and more places. They now own something like 30% of all packaged liquor outlets in Victoria between those two companies. And again, we saw trading hours sort of even further relaxed. 24-hour trading became more common. This idea of an on-premise liquor licence, which was a restaurant or a bar or a club, it could be sort of the specification of what something could do was less severe than it had been in the past. The last sort of little while until recently, things have started to shift down to the local level. More focus has gone into planning regulations than licensing regulations. Licensing became, at least up to about 2007, more or less a rubber stamp. If you wanted to open a new place, you'd be able to, provided you had planning permission. And local governments became responsible, therefore, for granting planning permission. But public health was never really a focus of the planning legislation. So public health really slipped out of the agenda here. And liquor licensing gradually became had less power in the state bureaucracy. So that's your history lesson. And there's kind of a common philosophy to all these changes, basically, up until 2007. And in all the reviews, there's a few pages or a chapter on this idea of, well, will freeing the market up cause problems? And all the people doing the reviews, kind of feeding off each other's previous work, say, no, we don't think it will. We think that increasing availability won't cause any change in consumption, it won't cause any change in harm. We think it will just provide a better service for the community. And the evidence they relied on here was usually pretty weak. They would compare two states, say, well, we've got more pubs in Victoria than they have in Tasmania and we have fewer problems, therefore it can't be the number of pubs that's the cause of the issue here. And when there was good evidence from overseas, a number of US studies came out in the 70s and 80s, they were kind of written off as being, well, it's a different drinking culture. American results don't have any real implications for how Australians drink. So they focused instead all about making the market more efficient, making it more convenient for people to buy alcohol. And to be fair, this has had some undoubted benefits. I mean, you look at going out in Melbourne now, there's some wonderful places to get the Good Food Guide from 1984, compare it to the one now. It's been huge changes in the industry. But the idea that was the only change that we were going to see was sort of driving these reviews. And this is just a graph showing three of the main licence categories and how they responded, the numbers of them responded to the various legislative changes. You can see, is my pointer? This is the Nieuwenhuizen Act, 1987. And you can see here really that on-premise, which is the restaurants and bars, really started to grow fast after that act came in. There was a brief uptick in the number of bottle shops, which kind of hit capacity here once Coles and Woolworths reached their 8%. They didn't have a lot of room to grow and the smaller players weren't really stepping in. The second act in 98, you can see that's freed up the packaged liquor market. So you see a great growth in the number of bottle shops since 1998. Pubs have sort of grown steadily through that area, are starting to sort of level off now, and restaurants and bars continue to really go through the roof. We've seen an increase of more than 4 times the number of places to buy alcohol in Victoria. I heard Commissioner Scipione this morning talking about the New South Wales research. About half the assaults in Sydney CBD are within 50 metres of a licensed premise. You'd be hard-pressed to find somewhere to stand in Melbourne CBD where you weren't within 50 metres of a licensed premise these days. It's really, there are thousands of them. It's amazing. And so what does all this mean? There's a growing research literature in this area, not just in Australia or the US, but predominantly from those 2 countries. And studies have found a range of effects from increasing the number of outlets in a neighbourhood. You can see effects on consumption, effects on traffic accidents, on child abuse and neglect, on STDs, on amenity issues like property damage or vandalism or noise, and on general sort of personal injuries. To be fair to all the authors of the Acts, most of this research has come from the late 90s onwards, so it wasn't all available when the decisions were being made. And the strongest evidence is really around violence. There are dozens and dozens of studies now from 20 cities or more across about 5 countries that show when you change the number of licensed premises in a neighbourhood, you change the rate of violence in that neighbourhood. You add more, you see more violence. You add less, you see less violence on the whole. There's mixed evidence around how number of outlets changes drinking. Looking at overall population drinking, there's not great evidence that adding more premises increases drinking, and that kind of gels with the Victorian experience. We've seen a quadrupling of licence numbers, and from the data that we have, which admittedly is quite poor, the amount of alcohol Victorians consume hasn't changed a great deal. There is, however, fairly consistent evidence from overseas that changes in availability affect youth consumption more than other consumption. And few of these studies have really focused explicitly on youth. I mean, all the ones focusing on violence are largely going to get at a youth population. So most of the harms that these studies look at are kind of harms that youth experience disproportionately, but there aren't many studies looking at how youth particularly respond to changes in availability.